Hi, I'm Chad with Move Forward Guitar. This lesson is from our series, Music Theory for Guitar. In this lesson, I'm going to give you an introduction to 7th chords. First off, if you'd like the diagrams for everything in this series, including the diagrams for this lesson, you can download our free e-guide, Music Theory for Guitar. And this e-guide will be something that you can study and use as a reference for years to come. And like I said, it's free, so there's no reason not to just go download it. But I am working on it as I'm filming this lesson, so if it's available, a link will pop up on the screen that will allow you to download it. If no link appears, you can look in the description and it'll say whether it's available or coming soon. And if it's not available yet, you can sign up for our mailing list and we'll send you a copy as soon as it is available. Also, if you're signed up for our mailing list, you'll receive all updated versions as well. But don't worry, you don't need the e-guide to follow along with this lesson because all of the charts will be on the screen. And also be sure to subscribe because we add at least one new lesson every day. This is part 3.1 from our series, Music Theory for Guitar. If you'd like to go back and start at the beginning, you can click the link on the screen. So this is the first lesson in the new section that we're starting, section 3, and in this section we're going to dive into more advanced chords starting with 7th chords as well as much more. And in this lesson I'm going to give you an introduction to the most important 7th chords you should learn. And the 7th chords are just taking the triads that we started with. We're going to leave out the augmented though, we're just going to look at major, minor, and diminished, and those triads were built with the 1, 3, 5, or stacking thirds to the 5th. 7th chords are just going to stack another third and give us a 7. So these are going to be 1, 3, 5, 7 of some sort. And we're going to start with the major triad. That'll give us 2 different 7th chords that we're going to look at. The minor triad, if we build off of that, is going to give us 1 7th chord that we're going to look at for now. And the diminished triad is going to give us 2 7th chords to look at. So in total, we're going to be looking at 5 7th chords. So we're going to start with the major triad. And like I said, there's 2 7th chords that you can get by extending the major triad out with a 7th. So as you know, a major triad is a root, major third, perfect 5th, or just a 1, 3, 5. The first 7th chord that we're going to get from the major triad is a major 7th chord. And a major 7th chord is a 1, 3, 5 and a 7. So it's a root, major third, perfect 5th, major 7th. So you're just taking that major triad and adding a major 7th to it. That gives you a major 7th chord. The next major chord we're going to get building on the major triad is a dominant 7th chord. And a dominant 7th chord is a root, major third, perfect 5th, minor 7th. And as you can see, the only difference between a major 7th chord and a dominant 7th chord is that a major 7th chord has a major 7 and a dominant 7th chord has a minor 7th. But they're both built on the major triad, so they're both major chords. Next, we're going to build one off the minor triad. And as you know, a minor triad is a root, flat 3, 5, or a root, minor third, perfect 5th. And the one we'll get from the minor triad is a minor 7th. And a minor 7th is a root, flat 3, 5, flat 7, or root, minor third, perfect 5th, minor 7th. So you're just adding a flat 7 to the minor triad, and that gives you a minor 7th chord. Now we're going to look at the 2 you can get from diminished. And as you know, a diminished is a root, flat 3, flat 5, or root, minor third, diminished 5th. The first one is what's called a minor 7th, flat 5. And that is taking the diminished triad and adding a flat 7 to it. So a minor 7 flat 5 is a root, flat 3, flat 5, flat 7, or a root, minor third, diminished 5th, minor 7th. And then the next one you can get from the diminished triad is one that is not in the major scale. So like the augmented, it's another chord that we're going to look at for now, but it's not part of the major scale. And we'll go more in depth into this later and where it comes from. But even though it's not part of the major scale, it's a really important chord to understand early on. And that's a diminished 7th chord. And a diminished 7th chord is adding a double flat 7 to the diminished triad. So you would get a root, flat 3, flat 5, double flat 7, or a root, minor third, diminished 5th, diminished seventh. And you may remember from previous lessons that the double flat 7 is the same thing as a major sixth. But when you're looking at it with a diminished 7th chord, you would list it as a double flat 7 or what's called a diminished 7th. And like I said, the diminished 7th chord is not part of the major scale, but it's important to understand, and we'll dive more into it later. So those are the 5 7th chords that are most important to understand that we're going to really dive into in the upcoming lessons and relate these back to the major scale like we did before and to chord progressions and all of that. And before we leave this lesson, we just want to look at this really quick. This is a chart that I made that shows you the chord. So here's the chord name: major 7th, dominant 7th, minor 7th flat 5, which is also known as a half diminished, and a diminished 7th, which sometimes people just refer to as a diminished, or actually even a fully diminished chord. And then over here in the middle, you'll see the formula, which is just the intervals of those chords, which is what we just went over. And then over here, I wanted to point this out and give you a place to reference it. It'll be in the e-guide, so you can look this up anytime you need to. These are the common chord symbols you'll run across. So with most of these, there's quite a few ways they can be written, and sometimes they can be even written in more than I've shown here, but these are by far the most common. And these are all written in C. That's why it says C major 7 and so on. But for example, a C major 7th you could see written this way, but you could also see it written this way with a capital M and a 7. Or you could see it written this way with a little triangle here and a 7. Or you could see it written this way with just a triangle, and that would still represent a C major 7. So all those would represent C major 7 if you saw those on a chart. And usually I'll use this one. It's just the one I like to use. And then a dominant 7th chord, you would only see this way. And when you look at a dominant 7th chord, you wouldn't call this, or at least you wouldn't have to, and most people don't, call this a C dominant 7th chord. You would just call this a C7 chord. And if anytime you see something where it's just a C7 or any letter name and a 7, that means it's a dominant 7th. Because if it's major 7th, it'll either say major 7th or have some sort of symbol that lets you know it's a major 7th. So that's how you can tell the difference between a dominant 7th or a major 7th chord. A dominant 7th is just going to have the 7th after the letter name. And then for minor 7th, you have these options. You have a C with a lowercase m and a 7, a C with an mi for minor and a 7th, or a C with a minus symbol and a 7th, and that's really common in jazz charts. But typically I'll use this one, and that's a really common one that you'll see as well. And then for a C minor 7 flat 5, you would see written all these ways with the C lowercase m, a 7 and a flat 5, or the C mi 7 and flat 5, or the C with the minus symbol representing minor 7 and the flat 5, or this one. And this little symbol right there represents half diminished. That's a half diminished symbol, and the reason it's listed like this sometimes is because this chord is also known as a half diminished chord. And we'll get into the difference between half diminished and fully diminished in a later lesson. And then for the diminished 7th chord, you'll see it written these ways: C with a dim 7, or C with this little circle. That little circle is representing a fully diminished, so that's the difference. This up here in the half diminished is a half diminished symbol. This one without that slash through it is a fully diminished. Or you could see it with that C fully diminished symbol and a 7, or a lot of times it's just written as C dim, which I don't like because that can get confusing with just a regular diminished triad. So usually I'll write it as C dim 7. But seeing it with this little circle, or the circle and the 7, is extremely common. So that's an introduction to 7th chords. You can move on to the next lesson where I'm going to actually show you how to build these on the fretboard and dive deeper into the theory behind each one. And be sure to download the e-guide. It has all these diagrams in it that you'll find really useful for years to come. And be sure to subscribe because we add at least one new lesson every day.